So this is January 2025. The lecture is Pathwick Lecture 16, Spiritual Nourishment. And this section, week 2, is about feeding the soul. Now, the easy part of the lecture is that feeding your spirit requires effort, and that it requires just as much effort as feeding your body, feeding your job, feeding your bank account, feeding your cat. And it's easy to say, well, of course. What I've been explaining a little bit in the meeting we've had is that very often this comes into conflict with other beliefs that don't have a reason to come up at the time. Meaning, we can say yes to one set of beliefs because we're not thinking about the other circumstances. And then the other circumstances come up later and we don't notice the discrepancy. So there is a place in culture, society, etc., where there is a pretty wide belief that there is a heaven, a place where you no longer need to work. And that may have come about because life on earth was so hard, you needed to believe in something easier. But the truth is, imagine what that is really like. I have a tendency to say, and what would my day look like if I had nothing to do day after day after day? The idea of the heaven that I was presented with in my family of origin was not appealing to me. I didn't like it. I enjoy work. I enjoy exercising talents and skills. I enjoy life. It's difficult for me to believe that in spirit all that vanishes and you just whirl around in a cloud, numbed out. And this would feed that idea, would feed the idea that when I get to a certain point, I won't have to work. Now, we might say work as hard, but that's where the gray area starts. Why would you not work just as hard once you had achieved a certain status in life as you did getting there? But you would have more choice and you could have more free reign, more free will, more latitude in what you do. But why would you stop? What's wrong with putting effort out? So that's what this first section addresses. The idea that there's no free lunch and we don't get to coast for extensive periods of time. The second part of this section deals, oddly enough, with the idea that good and bad are not inherent. Guide speaks of this in many, many other lectures. I'm very attracted to it. So when I select sections of the lecture to include, if I see that, I include it. That good and bad are not inherent, that there's a basic neutrality to everything, that we load with judgments, preconceptions, bias, history, and fear. But more than anything else, we load it with, I don't want that. I have my reasons. I don't want that. So it becomes bad. And what I want, whatever it is, becomes good. What I would like to suggest is that it is useful to cultivate a perspective that everything is neutral, to cultivate a perception where you basically go back to zero. You don't think something is inherently wonderful, but you don't think that it's inherently terrible. Find a place of neutrality and, in effect, rebuild your case, rebuild your beliefs, rebuild how you think about it. But if you start from wherever you are, you may already be in the place where something is considered good or bad inherently by itself, just for the sake of its existence, or that it's bad for the same reason. I'm not going to go into a bunch of examples, but I invite you to do so. I invite you to play with the idea and to come up with examples of things. Well, this is always bad. And then think about situations where it's not necessarily always bad. Now, of course, we come up with dramatic examples of death and destruction. But even in history, death and destruction aren't the end of it. Death and destruction very often set up a reaction in the people who remain that motivates them to then put more effort into overcoming any bad situations, bad work situations, whatever. And so to take this position of neutrality, oddly enough, it's important to take a larger perspective. You're going to have to stand back a little bit and see what would happen later, 10, 20, 30 years down the road, that this negative event or this painful event may spur people into action so that good things come of it. And then that will cycle around. There's a coming and going or cycling back and forth. The other thing is that when we label things as good and bad, this encourages a passivity. Because when we label things, we aren't just labeling them because of our personal relationship to that thing. We are labeling them because we are getting input from others about their beliefs, their values, their agendas, what they want. Now, the best example is children. Children are hostages in a very cruel world. They have to conform to their family of origin. They have to survive. They have to protect their heart. They have to learn to find love and pleasure among whatever dysfunction is going on around them. To do that, they have to accept certain paradigms that are presented to them by caretakers. And it's hard to outgrow these. Very often they become foundation stones in our the way we see the world, and we don't revisit them later on. It's what leads sometimes to that sense of spiritual madness, of losing your mind and realizing that you didn't have a hold of reality, because without realizing it, you had built a life based upon the beliefs of others, how to please others, how to keep distractions, how to keep dysfunction at a minimum, how to get through the day with as much pleasure as you can, meant that you had to accept some things and just go around them. I always enjoy referencing a story from the 1940s by Albert Payson Terhune. The story is called Fair Ellen. It's Fair Ellen. It's very short. It's about a blind dog. And on a farm, this dog was born. It was blind. They just didn't have the heart to kill it. So they thought, we'll see if this will work. And the dog grew up, very intelligent dog, very kind and loving dog. And it learned to cope with a sightless world, just like blind people do. But the dog learned to cope with a sightless world. And then one day they were talking to some friends in this farmhouse with a large yard. And they called to the dog to come. And the dog began to cross the yard. The dog would circumvent everything it had ever bumped into, everything that it had ever tripped over. The dog had been able to map its world so well that once something happened, it was able to remember geographically where that happened, and it would walk around it. Imagine what this looks like from an objective view. The dog is just creating, it's all over the place, crossing the yard. That's the dog's survival tactic. It serves the dog well. The dog now lives a happy and healthful life. It doesn't bump into things. But there's no way for the dog to know that these objects were temporary and that they're gone. And that is a memory I have of a story that I bring to Pathic lectures, and it helps me understand why people do sometimes the things they do. Because we're so we're not aware sometimes of where we have historically learned not to do something, that we just incorporate it into our lives, and we simply don't do it from that point forward. So back to good and bad are not inherent. It is very useful to find ground zero, to go back to some form of neutrality and see if you can understand things in that perspective. The other aspect of good and bad is to seek to understand how the root or cause was. So in other words, the thing may be terrible, but we may have ascribed the cause to something else in our ignorance, in our naivete, or based upon the words of others. So we may judge something as bad, but we also project back to the causes or the root of that and judge that as bad. So you not only clear up the situation itself, you clear up a whole story, a whole narrative that you are invisibly carrying in your head sometimes, by relying upon others' experiences even more so than your own. So, small summary of week 2 of Pathfic Lecture 16, Feeding the Soul. Thanks for listening.